Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It was a big week last week for the Prime Minister. As well as attending the G7 meeting in Cornwall, England, Scott Morrison used his UK trip to sign a free trade agreement with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, that country's first agreement since Brexit. He also met with French President Emmanuel Macron, continuing talks about a potential free trade agreement there too. I wanted to have a closer look at what it all means for Australia. Professor Tim Harcourt is one of the busiest people in economics. He's the industry professor and chief economist at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's also the host of the Airport Economist podcast on Listnr and TV show After the Pandemic on Ausbiz. And if that wasn't enough, he's written a new book as well, The Airport Economist Flies Again. If you haven't read Tim's books, go and read them. They're just fantastic. You don't have to be an economist to read Tim's work, and that's what makes it so good. Tim, how's that for an intro?
Oh, really impressed, mate. Thanks for all those plugs.
That's all right. Now, I think you know about as much about trade as anyone I know. Let's start with the very basics, though, so dumb it down for people like me. Why are free trade deals just so important, and particularly bilateral versus multilateral?
Well, Sean, in a perfect world, I guess unilaterally everyone would reduce their tariffs and let trade flow freely, like Adam Smith wanted it to. Given that we live in a second best world, as economists say, if we can't get the multilateral deal up because the WTO is as dead as a Doha, then we have to go for bilateral deals. And, they're second or third best, but sometimes it's all that's on the table. And that's why, we've got this one with the UK.
So just before we get into the UK one, the multilateralism really has died a death in the last 5 or so years. Is that a Trumpism or is it something more to it?
Oh, it was pre-Trump, I think. The US administration, even with George Bush Jr., was wanting to do all these bilateral deals more as, geopolitical in some ways. And in fact, Adrian Rowlands, one of your former colleagues from the press gallery, wrote about the bilateral deals from America being really about the response to September 11. So that they are pre-Trump.
Yeah.
And Trump's thing was he didn't really care what deal it was. He just said everyone did bad deals because they weren't businessmen like him. So he was going to rip them all up and do them again. He wasn't particularly in favour of one deal or another. He just thought he could do a better deal than anyone else could negotiating-wise.
Yeah. So the UK deal signed last week, sort of a win in a sense for Boris Johnson in the UK and Scott Morrison in Australia. Can you talk me through some of the specifics of the deal?
Yeah, sure. For Australia, the big wins were in agriculture because, as you know, under the old European Union system, the common agricultural policy meant that you could send all the cows from France around the world business class twice for the policy. So there's always been very high tariffs in Europe. So, the British said they would reduce the tariffs and give us a crack at the quotas in, beef and dairy and lamb and sugar and so on. And I didn't really expect that 6 weeks ago. I thought the English and Welsh farm lobby would be too strong, but Boris has said that that's fine. And significantly, the UK and Australia has a lot of people movement. Not that we can do it now with COVID, but usually we do.
Yep. And
so they've allowed people up to 35 to be able to work and live in each other's countries.
Yeah, I remember in my day, I was fortunate I had an EC passport, but you had to be 27 or less. So I think then went to 30 and then 35. It actually allows mobility of labour. There's quite a significant shift there.
It is, yeah. It's a bit like if you're 28, you could no longer be in Young Labor, but you could join the Young Liberals. It's sort of gone from 28.
Just swap over. Malcolm Turnbull might have done that.
He might have done that. I've done it a few times. But, that's quite significant. And the thing about the UK and Australia is that all the services and investment and sort of infrastructure investment like Macquarie and people like that is pretty significant. It's not big volumes and values like China or Korea or Japan with the iron ore, but in foreign investment in terms of services, architecture and telecommunications and professional lawyers going over is pretty big in the UK. So I think that's where they wanted to get a lot of the gains.
Okay. Were there many compromises we had to make?
Oh, here and there. I think in some ways we went probably further than we would have liked in some of the services areas. But interestingly to me, when I did the Airport Economist UK episode, we went to Cambridge because they have the big biomedical sort of hub that does a lot with South Australia. And there wasn't a lot on health sciences in the agreement. It could be that Donald Trump scared the Brits when he said the NHS is on the table. Mm-hmm. And you might remember Mark Latham, as opposition leader, keeping the PBS out of
Yeah.
the US negotiations. So, yeah, I thought there might have been a bit more movement there, but they're pretty careful to keep the health system separate.
Okay, now a lot's been made of the fact that it's the first FTA for Britain since Brexit. How significant is that?
They had to get off their duck because
Yeah.
during Brexit, Boris Johnson kept saying, if only we could break the shackles of Brussels, we can become the great, the global trade hub of the empire, like the land of Adam Smith. So he played this up a lot, and he's got to get cracking, with Japan, with Australia, and really show that Britain can stand alone because, at the end of the day, most of their trade is across the channel.
Yep.
So they've got to work pretty hard to convince these other countries to sign up.
Yeah. In a sense, it's almost symbolic as much as it is financial.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. A lot of it is about values, democratic systems, openness, in the same way that Biden was chipping China and Russia at the NATO meeting. It's very much about democratic values and like-minded nations forming alliances because, you know who is on the rise.
Yeah. Did you think, so Australia's talking to France, so I presume that's nowhere near as far advanced as the British one.
Well, Sean, I'm a South Australian originally, and South Australia is opening an office in Paris. So
it's because of all those ships, those subs, isn't it?
Yeah. A lot of it's defence related. We had a very effective guy John Rees, working in the South Australian office in London, in Australia House, who speaks French. He's got a Legion of Honour and all these awards from France. He's been working on French food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, defence for a long, long time. So I think a lot of the groundwork has been done in France, believe it or not.
Right. And what sort of things do you think would get out of a deal with France?
Oh, it's got to be a lot of defence procurement and a lot of infrastructure and aviation, amazing French companies, not just in Paris, but in Toulouse and places like that. So I think still a significant economy. But the amazing thing I found this in the Brexit special, that when you look at small businesses in Australia, there's 6,000 in the UK, and that is twice that of Germany, which is a much big economy, and France and so on. So when I was at Austrade, people used to always complain about channel fever and the Kylie effect, everyone just going to London and forgetting the continent, as the Brits used to call it.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, people go where they're comfortable with the language and the institutions and the legal system, and that's the UK.
Yeah. So tell me, have we got any other FTAs we're negotiating at the moment?
Well, we'll have to do the rest of Europe, of course.
Yeah.
We've had Europhobia. We'll have to show some Eurovision, to do something.
Please, lots of Eurovision.
Lots of Eurovision, and there's always been talk of a Gulf cooperation one. We did the Airport Economist UAE episode, so that's a bit of a hub. So there's a few, I guess, hubs coming along that are pretty effective, and of course depends on how quick Britain is, because Britain, they've got to go run around and do some trade deals in Asia now, because they sort of let us off the hook for a long time, being stuck in Europe. Is that Australia got the march on them in Asia, so now the Brits will have to be competition.
What do you think about the FTA we've done with, or the trade deal at least, maybe not totally free trade, but the trade deal with the USA, which must be, I'm guessing, Tim, it's a decade old or something like that?
2005 we signed it.
2000, so 15 years.
Yeah.
How has that evolved? Has that been good for Australia?
Well, the global financial crisis sort of clobbered the potential gains in some ways. But there were some useful things with the E3 visas and things, that we got some good deals like we did with Britain with working visas and things. So I think that's where a lot of the benefits from those things come. Famously, they left sugar out.
That's right.
So Mark Bayer wasn't very happy about that. In the same year, we signed one with Thailand. The Thailand one's been very successful, but Thailand doesn't get the same publicity the US gets because of the politics.
Yeah. Stay with me, Tim. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Tim Harcourt, Industry Professor and Chief Economist at the University of Technology, Sydney, and host of the Airport Economist. Now, look, while I've got you, on a recent episode of your Ausbiz TV show After the Pandemic, you spoke to the aforementioned Malcolm Turnbull about Australia's relationship with China. And he has been generally very sensible about that relationship over a long time and whether trade can take off again. Having spoken to him, what's your take on it and what do you think his take was?
Well, it's interesting in Australia because we've got, on the show, I interviewed people like David Koch, of course, Port Adelaide Football Club chairman, Olivia Wang, the head of Fortescue Metals, Elizabeth Gaines, Quiggie's right-hand woman, and they all talked about the commercial relationship, how important it is to Australia, we know, with the iron ore and the services and the rocks and crops. But then there is a a security community who really, honest, Sean, don't think a lot about economics.
Yeah.
Who are so concerned about China's military threat that they think we should just diversify to Indonesia or India tomorrow, which is just not possible. So you felt the tension in the program between the sort of, the blue hats, the defence types, and then the commercial people. And Turnbull's probably the person who really walked the line reasonably well. He just said, fantastic, important relationship with us, and he talked a lot about his personal ties to Xi Jinping, but he just said, doesn't mean you do what they say. You've got to stand up for your own values at the end of the day, and you get more respect doing that than caving in.
Yeah, it is interesting. Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Queensland Premier, and Mark McGowan, the WA Premier, last week were both critical. I mean, they should sort of strand both those sides of the blue hats and the commercial side, but both of those actually came out and were critical of the federal government about the stance that's been taken. And obviously they're resource states, so they are hit by it. I just thought it was interesting that politicians were coming out that way.
Not usual, is it? Usually state premiers aren't involved in foreign policy, and then Dan Andrews signed up for the Belt and Road, which was very unusual. But China wants to do this because they want to play the states against each other. I think in some ways the Premier's comments were more to how should you diplomatically handle China even if you don't agree with them. And I think they probably thought the rhetoric was a bit too hard, and going in and saying let's just have an inquiry into Wuhan without getting everyone else on board they were critical of. But Malcolm Turnbull was probably the first issue I've seen him not critical of Scott Morrison on. He thought the government had no choice but to act like they have.
Interesting, because Malcolm Turnbull isn't known for being a huge supporter of Scott Morrison.
No, for some reason, and on every other issue that he's done media on, he hasn't been. But on this one, he was reasonably supportive, and also he had his own dilemmas on how China changed. He was talking about at APEC in Vietnam in 2017 how you saw a sharp change in the Chinese stance. A lot of the people in the program, like David Koch, say, you've got to handle China delicately with respect and trust and so on, which is right. But of course, it's not just what Australia does, it's also how China acts as well.
Yeah. We had Mike Smith on the show. Now, Mike is the AFR correspondent.
Yes, that's right.
And what I thought was really interesting in that conversation was normal living in China is like normal living in Sydney. Obviously culturally different, but it's not like there's a thought police or secret police around it. It's just normal life. And I think we forget that sometimes.
We do, A lot of my Chinese friends were commenting, even some I know from Wuhan, who very different to their parents, who had very different perspectives of the party and so on. But a lot of them felt they'd had freedom coming to Australia, particularly studying at university here. But then they said all the woke stuff makes them feel like they're back in China, in terms of freedom of speech. So they thought the West was almost, deliberalising its own freedoms voluntarily without pressure from the outside.
It's interesting. Tim, what are you doing now you can't travel? You must be going crazy.
Oh, it's all right. No, we've done the show. Unfortunately, Koshy says the show's better now that I don't travel.
By the way, I love the fact that you say David Koch is the president of Port Football Club.
Well, Adelaide, he is.
It's factually correct. The rest of the country outside South Australia know him as the bloke on TV. You do know that, don't you? You are as practically as they come, I'd like to say, as a South Australian.
Port Adelaide's been around since 1870, so it's got a long history.
Yeah, fair enough. Who am I to argue? Tim, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you very much, Sean. Appreciate it.
That was Professor Tim Harcourt from UTS, author, podcast host and television presenter. Find out more at the Airport Economist, all one word, theairporteconomist.com. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.